Okay, I need you to picture something with me. It's late evening in Copenhagen, early January 2026. The winter darkness has settled over the Danish capital, that deep Nordic darkness that seems to swallow everything. Inside government buildings, lights burn late into the night. Officials are on the phone, texting, refreshing their screens, because something unprecedented is unfolding. And it's not coming from Moscow. It's not coming from Beijing. It's coming from Washington. The President of the United States has just threatened 8 of America's closest allies with economic warfare unless they agree to help him take control of Greenland. Not negotiate, not discuss, take control. And the threat isn't subtle. 10% tariffs starting February 1st, 25% by June, until Denmark hands over a territory that has belonged to them for centuries. This is where we are. This is the story we're living through right now. And to understand why this moment matters, why it's sending shockwaves through global markets and diplomatic channels, why bipartisan delegations of American lawmakers are flying to Europe to apologise for their own president, we need to understand how we got here and what happens next. Let's start at the beginning, because Trump's obsession with Greenland isn't new. During his first term, back in 2019, he floated the idea of buying the island from Denmark. The Danish Prime Minister called the suggestion absurd, and Trump, visibly irritated, cancelled a planned visit to Copenhagen. Most people assumed it was another Trump headline that would fade away. But it didn't fade, it festered. And when he returned to office in January 2025, Greenland was back on his mind. By late 2025, the rhetoric was escalating. Trump started talking about Greenland in security terms, claiming Russia and China were circling the territory, threatening American interests. He appointed a special envoy to Greenland. His administration started discussing military options. And then, in early January 2026, everything accelerated. Trump made it explicit. He wanted total control of Greenland. Not just military access, which the United States already has under a 1951 defence agreement. Not just expanded cooperation. Total control. Ownership. He refused to rule out military force. When asked directly if he would invade, he said, "We'll go as far as we have to." Now stop and think about what that means. Greenland is part of Denmark. Denmark is a founding member of NATO. NATO has a principle called Article 5, collective defence, the bedrock of the entire alliance. An attack on one member is treated as an attack on all. So when Trump threatens military action against Greenland, he's not just threatening Denmark. He's threatening to shatter the most successful military alliance in modern history. He's talking about American troops potentially fighting against European allies over land acquisition. Denmark's response was immediate and unequivocal. Greenland is not for sale. Its people, all 57,000 of them, have a right to self-determination. Polling showed over 85% of Greenlanders opposed any US takeover. The Danish Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, made it crystal clear. "Greenland belongs to the Greenlanders," she said. "The US shall not take over Greenland." But Trump wasn't backing down. He ordered the Joint Special Operations Command to draw up invasion plans. Senior military officials pushed back, but the order stood. Then came the tariff threat. On January 18th, Trump announced he would impose 10% tariffs on 8 European countries: Denmark, Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands and Finland. Why these 8? Because they had deployed small training contingents to Greenland as part of a NATO exercise called Arctic Endurance, a routine security operation designed to bolster Arctic defence. Trump called it a very dangerous situation for the safety, security and survival of our planet. Let that sink in. NATO allies conducting a defensive training exercise in NATO territory was, according to the president, an existential planetary threat. The tariffs would start February 1st. They would rise to 25% by June, and they would remain in place until such time as a deal is reached for the complete and total purchase of Greenland. The reaction was swift and devastating. Within hours, global stock markets went into freefall. On January 20th, the S&P 500 fell 2.1%, its worst day since October. The Nasdaq dropped 2.4%. The Dow shed 870 points. More than $1.2 trillion in value was wiped off the S&P 500 in a single day. European markets tumbled in parallel. Germany's DAX fell 1%. Britain's FTSE dropped. Italy's markets slid. The CBOE Volatility Index, Wall Street's fear gauge, spiked to levels not seen since November. Investors were panicking. The US dollar fell nearly 1% against a basket of foreign currencies. Gold hit a new record high as money fled to safe havens. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent tried to calm markets, telling investors to take a deep breath and claiming Trump had a strategy. But the selling continued. Citigroup analysts wrote that the number and magnitude of impacts on US equity markets is already dizzying, just 2 weeks into the year. The CEO of UBS said he saw no path to normalisation in the near future. And it wasn't just markets. The political fallout was explosive. European leaders issued a joint statement calling Trump's tariff threats a move that would undermine transatlantic relations and risk a dangerous downward spiral. French President Emmanuel Macron said, "No intimidation nor threat will influence us." German officials coordinated with EU partners on a response. Sweden's Prime Minister declared, "We will not allow ourselves to be blackmailed." The European Union scheduled an emergency summit. They began discussing activating something called the anti-coercion instrument, a mechanism that would allow them to impose sweeping restrictions on US tech companies operating in Europe. They talked about suspending the trade agreement negotiated with the US just months earlier. Some analysts estimated that if Europe retaliated with full force, targeting not just goods but services, they could hit sectors representing nearly 1% of US GDP. But here's what might be most significant. The backlash wasn't just coming from Europe, it was coming from Congress. Bipartisan delegations of American lawmakers flew to Copenhagen to apologise. Republican Senator Lisa Murkowski, Democrat Chris Coons, Republican Tom Tillis, Democrat Jean Shaheen, all travelling together to reassure Danish and Greenlandic officials that Congress opposed Trump's approach. Senator Tillis called the idea of seizing Greenland beyond stupid. He said the advisers pushing Trump toward military action should not be in Washington. Murkowski said the threat was completely inappropriate and urged Congress to reassert its constitutional authority over tariffs. Nebraska Republican Don Bacon called the whole situation embarrassing and shameful. Even Speaker of the House Mike Johnson, generally supportive of Trump, said military action in Greenland was not something anybody's seriously considering. Senator John Kennedy, a Trump ally, said invading Greenland would be weapons-grade stupid. Senator Mitch McConnell issued a rare public criticism. A resolution was introduced in the Senate to block Trump from invading Greenland. The congressional pushback was unlike anything we'd seen before on foreign policy. Republicans who had defended Trump through 2 impeachments, who had stood by him through countless controversies, were breaking ranks. Why? Because the implications were too severe to ignore. Taking Greenland by force would destroy NATO. It would end 75 years of transatlantic security cooperation. It would tell every American ally that partnership with Washington meant nothing if the president decided he wanted your territory. It would legitimize exactly the kind of territorial aggression that Russia used in Crimea and that China dreams of using elsewhere. And it would do all of this for what? For minerals that could be accessed through partnership? For military bases the US already has access to? The human cost was visible too. In Nuuk, Greenland's capital, almost a third of the entire city's population took to the streets in protest. People held signs reading, "Greenland is not for sale," and "Make America go away." Greenlandic politicians spoke with raw emotion about feeling betrayed, about their homeland being treated as a real estate transaction, about their people's dignity being trampled. In Copenhagen, thousands gathered outside the US Embassy. The mood was one of shock and anger. Denmark has been one of America's most loyal allies. Danish troops fought in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in the Balkans. Over 40 Danes died in those conflicts, fighting alongside American soldiers. Now their president was threatening to invade their territory unless they surrendered it. Then came Davos. On January 21st, Trump arrived at the World Economic Forum in Switzerland to meet with global leaders. The atmosphere was tense. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney had given a speech the day before, warning that the rules no longer protect you, and urging countries to seek alternatives to American partnerships. European leaders were coordinating responses. Financial markets remained deeply unstable. Trump gave a speech that morning, and in it he did something no one expected. He ruled out using force to take Greenland. "You can say yes, and we will be very appreciative," he told Denmark. "Or you can say no, and we will remember." But he said military action was off the table. Hours later came the bigger announcement. Trump met with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. After their meeting, Trump posted that they had reached the framework of a future deal with respect to Greenland, and in fact the entire Arctic region. And because of this framework, he was cancelling the tariffs. All of them. Immediately. Markets erupted in relief. The Dow surged over 1%. The S&P jumped. European stocks rallied. The taco trade was back, investors said. Trump always chickens out. The pattern that had defined his approach to tariffs: threaten dramatically, then back down and claim victory. But here's where the story gets complicated. Because what exactly is this framework? Trump said it was a great deal for the United States that gets everything we wanted. He mentioned deploying part of his Golden Dome missile defence system in Greenland. He talked about accessing rare earth minerals. He said discussions would continue, led by Vice President J.D. Vance, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and Special Envoy Steve Witkoff. NATO's Rutte said the framework would focus on bolstering Arctic security, ensuring Russia and China don't gain a foothold in Greenland. He said NATO would work with commanders to determine what additional security measures were needed. He notably said that Greenland's sovereignty did not come up in his conversation with Trump. But Denmark and Greenland? They're telling a very different story. Denmark's foreign minister said territorial integrity must be respected, that Denmark can exercise sovereignty in Greenland as a NATO member. Greenland's prime minister said sovereignty is a red line that cannot be crossed. He acknowledged they're ready to discuss better partnerships, more cooperation, but not transferring control to the United States. So what's the actual deal? According to sources familiar with the discussions, it might involve the US getting enhanced access to military facilities in Greenland, which it already largely has under the 1951 agreement. It might involve cooperation on rare earth mineral extraction, though specifics are unclear. It might involve expanded NATO operations in the Arctic, but it does not, according to Danish and Greenlandic officials, involve any transfer of sovereignty or territory. In other words, Trump threatened to blow up the Atlantic alliance, crashed global markets, triggered bipartisan congressional revolt, and unified European opposition, all to potentially achieve a deal for things the United States could have negotiated without any threats at all. Some analysts are calling it a strategic win for Trump, saying he got increased security cooperation and face-saving language. Others are calling it a humiliating retreat, saying he achieved nothing he couldn't have gotten by simply asking. The truth is probably somewhere in between, but what's undeniable is the damage done along the way. Let's talk about what that damage looks like. First, NATO. The alliance has been shaken. Not broken, but shaken. European leaders spent weeks genuinely uncertain whether their primary security guarantor might attack one of their members. That uncertainty doesn't vanish because Trump backed down. It's embedded now. Countries that depended entirely on American protection are developing contingency plans. What if next time he doesn't back down? Second, economic relationships. Canada signed a new trade deal with China while this was unfolding. European leaders are openly discussing reducing dependence on American markets. The EU-US trade agreement negotiated in 2025 is now on hold. When your most important trading partners can't trust that agreements will hold, that trade won't be weaponised, capital moves elsewhere. And it is moving. Third, American credibility. For decades, the United States built its influence on the idea that alliances meant something, that partnerships were based on shared values, not just convenience. Trump's Greenland gambit undermines that foundation. If territorial integrity can be threatened over minerals and military bases, what exactly does American friendship protect you from? Fourth, the precedent. Trump's approach establishes that a president can use emergency economic powers, tariff threats, and military coercion to try to acquire territory from allies. What stops the next president from doing the same? What stops adversaries from pointing to this moment and saying, "See, the United States doesn't respect sovereignty either"? The norms that constrained aggressive territorial behaviour have been weakened, and rebuilding them will take years. But there's also a counter-narrative worth considering. Maybe this was always performative. Maybe Trump never intended to invade Greenland, and the whole episode was designed to pressure NATO into increasing Arctic security spending and cooperation. Maybe he got what he wanted, a commitment to bolster defences in a region increasingly contested by Russia and China, and the tariff threats were just leverage. If that's true, the cost-benefit calculation looks different. But even then, the costs were enormous. Over $1 trillion in market value lost, congressional time wasted, Allied trust damaged. For what? A vague framework that might result in outcomes achievable through normal diplomacy. What happens now? The framework isn't a deal yet, it's a framework. Negotiations continue. Vice President Vance, Secretary Rubio, and the Special Envoy are supposedly working on details. But the Danish and Greenlandic governments have made clear their red lines. No sovereignty transfer, no territorial control. They'll discuss partnership, cooperation, mutual security interests, but Greenland remains Danish, its future determined by Greenlanders. Can Trump accept that, or will this cycle restart in a few months? The Trump administration has a pattern: escalate dramatically, back down partially, claim victory, then escalate again when attention fades. We might be in a temporary lull before the next round. Meanwhile, the broader implications are still unfolding. The Arctic is becoming a critical theatre of great power competition. Climate change is opening new sea routes, making previously inaccessible resources reachable. Russia has been militarising its Arctic territories. China has declared itself a near-Arctic state and is investing heavily in the region. Greenland sits at the centre of this competition, with vast deposits of rare earth minerals critical for modern technology. The United States has legitimate strategic interests in ensuring Greenland doesn't become economically or militarily dominated by adversaries. The question is method. Does the US build partnerships based on mutual benefit and shared security concerns, or does it threaten, coerce, and demand? Trump's approach has been the latter, and the result is that Denmark and Greenland, which were previously open to increased cooperation, are now deeply wary. European allies who might have supported greater American involvement in Arctic security are now questioning whether they want to enable what looks like territorial expansionism. China and Russia, meanwhile, are watching and learning, seeing how fractures in Western alliances can be exploited. This is the chaos of the moment we're living through. A framework deal that might mean everything or nothing. Markets that rallied on relief but remain deeply uncertain about what comes next. Allies who want to trust American assurances but can't forget that their president threatened economic warfare over territorial demands. A precedent established that power, not partnership, is the primary currency of this administration's foreign policy. The next few weeks will be critical. If the framework negotiations produce genuine cooperation on Arctic security, if Denmark and Greenland feel their sovereignty is respected, if Congress maintains its oversight role, then maybe this episode becomes a near miss rather than a fundamental rupture. But if Trump grows frustrated with the slow pace of negotiations, if he perceives Denmark as obstructing his goals, if he decides another tariff threat or worse is necessary, then we'll be right back here. Markets will crash again. Allies will protest again. And each time this happens, a little more trust erodes, a little more credibility is lost, a little more damage is done to relationships that took 75 years to build. This is the uncertainty we're living with. Not the uncertainty of whether a deal will happen, but the uncertainty of whether the system of alliances and partnerships that has defined the post-World War II order can survive a president who sees them as obstacles rather than assets. Whether democratic allies can trust that their sovereignty will be respected. Whether markets can function when policy is made through dramatic threats and sudden reversals. And whether, at the end of all this, we look back and see this as the moment when America's global leadership began its irreversible decline, not because of enemies abroad, but because of chaos at home. That's the story. That's where we are. A framework deal that might mean cooperation or coercion. Allies who want to trust but can't quite. Markets that rallied but remain on edge. And a president who got his headline, claimed his victory, but may have damaged something far more valuable than anything Greenland could ever offer. If this breakdown helped you understand what's actually happening with Trump's Greenland gambit, the details behind the headlines, and why this matters far beyond just one deal, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and consider subscribing. We're living through historic moments, and it's important to understand them clearly, without the spin, without the partisan talking points, just the facts and their implications. In the comments, I'm curious about your take. Do you think this framework deal actually resolves anything, or are we just in a temporary pause before the next escalation? And what do you make of the broader pattern, the threats followed by walkbacks, the chaos followed by claims of victory? Is it strategy or improvisation? Let me know what you think. Thanks for watching.